The lawyer slid the papers across the table, and Ethan Whitfield felt his hand shake before he even touched the pen. 3 days. That was all the time he had left before his father's company collapsed under a debt nobody had told him about until it was too late. The man across from him, a stern figure named Gerald Ashworth, tapped the folder with 2 fingers and said the marriage had to happen by Friday, or the agreement was void, and everything his father built would be sold piece by piece to strangers. Ethan had buried his father only 6 weeks earlier. He had not even finished sorting through the old man's study, the drawers still full of unopened letters, when the accountant called with the news that changed his life. His father owed a debt to the Ashworth family going back 20 years, a private loan that had kept the company alive during a difficult season, and the agreement attached to that loan had one condition buried in fine print. If the debt was never repaid in cash, it would be settled through marriage between the 2 families. Ethan had laughed when he first heard it, certain it was some kind of joke from another century. Nobody signed contracts like that anymore. But the paper in front of him was real, his father's signature at the bottom in fading blue ink, and Gerald Ashworth was not smiling. He did not know the woman he was supposed to marry. Nobody had shown him a photograph, and nobody had given him her name until that morning, when Gerald simply said Ava and pushed the folder closer. Ethan sat in the cold office with the city noise pressing against the window, and he understood that his choices had shrunk down to one narrow path. Sign the papers, marry a stranger, and save 200 employees from losing their jobs. Or refuse and lose everything his father had spent a lifetime building, along with any respect he had left for the man's memory. He signed the papers with a hand that did not feel like his own. The wedding took place 4 days later in a small hall with gray curtains and folding chairs. Nothing like the wedding he had imagined for himself as a younger man, back when he still believed in love arriving on its own schedule. There were no flowers scattered down an aisle, no laughter from friends, only a handful of lawyers and a photographer hired to prove the event had legally occurred. Ethan stood at the front in a dark suit that felt too tight around his shoulders, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the door at the far end of the room. When it opened, a woman walked through wearing a simple ivory dress, her dark hair pulled back, her face calm in a way that struck him as strange for someone entering a marriage built entirely on paperwork. She did not look at him the way brides were supposed to look at grooms. She looked at him the way someone studies a locked door, careful, guarded, waiting to see what was on the other side. Her name was Ava Bennett, and as she walked closer, Ethan felt something tug at the edge of his memory, faint and formless, like a word sitting on the tip of his tongue that refused to surface. He told himself it was nothing. Nerves, exhaustion, the strange pressure of the entire week collapsing onto one afternoon. He shook the feeling off and focused on getting through the ceremony without saying something he would regret. The officiant spoke quickly, aware that everyone in the room wanted this finished as fast as possible. Ethan repeated his vows in a flat voice, the words meaning nothing to him beyond their legal weight. Ava's voice, when it was her turn, was quiet but steady, and for one brief moment she looked directly into his eyes, and again that strange tug returned, stronger this time, like a hand reaching up from deep water. He blinked, and the feeling vanished as quickly as it came. They signed the register. Gerald Ashworth shook Ethan's hand with a grip that felt more like a warning than a congratulation, and said the debt was now considered settled, so long as the marriage held for a minimum of 2 years. If Ethan tried to end things early, the original loan would be called in full with interest, an amount that would destroy the company overnight. Ethan understood the threat clearly. He was not simply married. He was trapped, bound by a clock he could not see but could already feel ticking. Ava said very little as they left the hall together. In the car, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window at the gray afternoon, and Ethan found himself glancing at her more than he intended. There was something oddly familiar about the shape of her profile, the way she tilted her head slightly when she was thinking, but he could not place why a stranger would feel familiar at all. He told himself again that it meant nothing. His house was large and quiet, built for a family that had never quite arrived, since Ethan had spent most of his adult life focused on work rather than relationships. When they stepped inside, Ava paused in the entryway and looked around slowly, taking in the tall windows and the bare walls, and Ethan felt an unexpected flicker of embarrassment, as though the emptiness of the house revealed something about the emptiness of his life. He showed her to a guest room down the hall from his own, keeping his voice businesslike, explaining that she was free to decorate it however she liked, that the housekeeper came twice a week, that he usually left early for the office and returned late. Ava listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she simply nodded and said thank you, her tone polite but distant, as though she had expected nothing warmer and was not disappointed to receive exactly that. That night, Ethan sat alone in his study with a glass of untouched whiskey, staring at the folder of documents that had upended his life. He thought about his father, about the secrets the old man had kept, about the strange debt that had reached across 20 years to reshape his future. He thought about the stranger now sleeping under his roof, a woman he had promised to share his life with on paper, though he knew almost nothing about her beyond her name. He told himself it was temporary. 2 years and then he could quietly end the arrangement, return to his old life, and forget the entire chapter had ever happened. It seemed like a reasonable plan, clean and simple. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small, stubborn thought refused to let him rest. He had felt something when Ava first looked at him. Not attraction, not exactly, but recognition, faint and buried like a photograph left in the sun too long, its edges curling, its details almost impossible to make out. He poured the whiskey down the sink untouched and went to bed, telling himself that sleep would clear his head. Instead, he dreamed of a lake he had not thought about in over 20 years, sunlight scattering across the water, and a child's laughter echoing somewhere just out of reach. He woke before dawn, heart-pounding, unable to remember why the dream had unsettled him so deeply, only that it had, and that somewhere in his chest, something old and forgotten had just begun to stir. Downstairs, unable to fall back asleep, he found the kitchen light already on. Ava stood by the window with a cup of tea between her hands, still wearing the plain robe from the guest room, her hair loose now instead of pinned back. She startled slightly when she saw him, then offered a small, careful smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either, simply the silence of two strangers standing at the edge of a life they had not chosen but now had to build together. Ethan finally broke it, asking if she had slept well, and Ava answered honestly that she had not, admitting the house still felt unfamiliar. He nodded, understanding completely, since the whole situation felt unfamiliar to him too, despite it being his own home. He noticed, without meaning to, the way she held her teacup with both hands, elbows tucked close to her body, a small and specific habit that struck him as oddly familiar, though he could not say why. He pushed the thought away again, blaming it on exhaustion and the strange stress of the week. Before he left for work that morning, Ethan paused at the door and turned back to look at her one more time. She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something between curiosity and caution, and for a brief second he almost asked her directly whether they had ever met before that lawyer's office. But the question felt foolish, impossible even, so he swallowed it down and walked out into the cold morning air instead, telling himself that whatever strange feeling kept rising in his chest would fade with time. It did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger with every day that followed, a quiet, persistent whisper he could not silence, insisting that somewhere in his past, long before the lawyer's office and the wedding hall, he had already met the woman now living under his roof, and that he had somehow, impossibly, forgotten her. As his car pulled away from the house, Ethan glanced once in the rearview mirror and saw Ava still standing at the window, watching him go, her expression unreadable, her eyes following the car until it disappeared around the corner, and something about the way she watched him leave made his chest tighten with a feeling he could not name, sharp and unfamiliar, yet somehow as old as memory itself. 2 years, he reminded himself again, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. 2 years, and then this would all be over. He had no idea, driving away that morning, just how wrong he was about to be. Over the following days, the arrangement settled into an uneasy rhythm. Ethan left early each morning and returned late each night, burying himself in work the way he always had, using long hours as both distraction and armor. Ava kept to herself during the day, quietly making the guest room her own, adding small touches here and there. A folded blanket, a stack of books, a single framed photograph she kept turned slightly away from view whenever he passed her open door. He noticed the photograph once, just the edge of it, a corner of blue sky and green grass. But he did not ask about it, telling himself it was not his business, that prying into her past would only complicate an arrangement that needed to stay simple. Yet the unanswered question lingered at the back of his mind, joining the growing pile of small, unexplained details that refused to leave him alone. At dinner, which they now shared out of practicality rather than affection, conversation remained careful and shallow, both of them avoiding anything personal. Ava asked about his work, and he gave brief, polite answers. He asked about her day, and she offered equally brief replies. Neither pushed further, both aware that deeper questions might lead somewhere neither of them was ready to go. Still, small moments slipped through the careful distance they maintained. One evening, Ethan mentioned offhand that he had once spent summers at his grandfather's lake house as a boy, and Ava's hand paused halfway to her glass, her eyes flickering toward him with an intensity that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. He noticed it, filed it away, but said nothing, unsure what to make of it, unwilling yet to open a door he was not certain he wanted opened. That night, lying awake in the dark, Ethan found himself thinking not about the company, not about the debt, not even about his father, but about a lake he had not visited in over 2 decades, and a summer he had spent there as a child, and a friend whose face he could no longer clearly remember, though something told him, quietly and persistently, that the memory mattered more than he currently understood. He fell asleep still turning the thought over, unaware that just down the hall, Ava lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling, holding a memory of her own far more vivid than his, a promise made beside a summer lake many years earlier, and the quiet, aching hope that one day, somehow, he might finally remember it too. 3 weeks into the marriage, Ethan's mother, Margaret, arrived unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as she swept through the front door without waiting to be invited in. She had not attended the wedding, still recovering from a knee surgery that had kept her out of the country, but she had heard every detail from Gerald Ashworth himself, and she made no secret of her disapproval. She stood in the hallway with her coat still buttoned, studying Ava from head to toe the way a jeweler studies a stone before deciding whether it is real or fake. Ava did not flinch under the scrutiny. She offered her hand politely, introduced herself with a steady voice, and invited Margaret to sit for tea, as though the older woman's cold stare meant nothing at all. Ethan, watching from the doorway, felt an unexpected flicker of admiration. He had braced himself for an uncomfortable scene, certain his mother would say something cutting, and instead found himself surprised by how calmly Ava absorbed the tension in the room, refusing to be rattled by it. Over tea, Margaret asked pointed questions, testing Ava's patience with each one. Where had she grown up? What had her family done for work before the debt existed? Had she ever expected to marry into money? Ava answered each question honestly, without defensiveness, explaining that she had grown up outside the city, that her father had worked in shipping before his business partnership with Ethan's father years earlier, and that she had never once imagined her life would lead her into a house like this one. At the mention of a business partnership between their fathers, something in Ethan's chest tightened. He had assumed the debt was simply a loan, a one-time transaction between 2 men who barely knew each other. He had not realized their fathers had actually worked together, that there was history between the families stretching back further than he understood. He opened his mouth to ask a question, then closed it again, uncertain why the information unsettled him so deeply. Margaret left an hour later, her opinion of Ava seemingly unchanged, though she paused at the door and said almost reluctantly that the girl had a spine, which from Margaret was as close to a compliment as anyone in the family ever received. Ethan closed the door behind her and turned to find Ava already clearing the tea cups, her expression calm, though her hands moved a little faster than necessary, betraying the effort it had taken to remain composed through the entire visit. He offered to help, and she let him, and for the first time since the wedding, they worked side by side in comfortable silence, rinsing cups and drying them. The kitchen filled with the quiet clink of porcelain rather than the strained conversation that usually filled the space between them. When they finished, Ava thanked him, and Ethan found himself lingering in the kitchen a moment longer than necessary, unwilling to break whatever fragile ease had settled between them. That night, curiosity finally overcame his hesitation, and Ethan asked her directly about her father's partnership with his own father. Ava's expression shifted, something guarded passing behind her eyes, and for a moment he thought she might refuse to answer. Instead, she told him that their fathers had built a shipping venture together decades earlier, before a disagreement split them apart, and that the loan Gerald had used to bind their marriage together was actually the remains of an old debt from that very venture, one that had never been properly settled between the two families. Ethan absorbed the information slowly, pieces of a larger picture beginning to form in his mind. Their families were connected far deeper than a simple business loan. There was history here, old and tangled, stretching back to a time before either of them had been born. He asked if she knew more, and Ava hesitated, glancing away toward the window, before saying quietly that some of it was better left buried, that not every old story deserved to be dug back up. Her answer only deepened his curiosity, but something in her tone told him not to push further that night. He let the subject drop, though it stayed with him long after she had gone up to bed, turning over in his mind alongside the persistent, unexplained sense of familiarity that continued to shadow every interaction between them. The following week brought a different kind of pressure. Ethan's company was hosting a formal dinner for investors, an event that required his full attention, and for the first time required Ava's presence as his wife. He explained the situation to her carefully, apologizing in advance for the awkwardness of parading their arrangement in front of strangers. But Ava simply nodded and said she understood the stakes, that she would do whatever was needed to protect the company, and by extension, the 200 employees whose jobs depended on it. Her willingness to help, despite having no real stake in his business beyond the strange contract that bound them together, struck him deeply. He realized, watching her prepare for the evening, that she had never once complained about the unfairness of her situation, never once acted as though she resented the position she had been placed in. She simply adapted, quietly and steadily, the way someone accustomed to difficult circumstances learns to move through them without drawing attention to the struggle. The dinner itself unfolded smoothly on the surface, though tension simmered beneath every polished smile and rehearsed handshake. Ava moved through the room with quiet grace, answering questions about their marriage with practiced ease, deflecting personal inquiries without ever seeming rude. Ethan found himself watching her from across the room more than once, impressed by how naturally she navigated a world that should have been completely unfamiliar to her. Midway through the evening, an older investor named Charles Whitmore approached Ethan with a knowing look and asked, almost too casually, whether he remembered the Bennett family from years ago, back when his father used to bring him along on business trips to the coast. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question, admitting he did not recall any specific memories from those trips, since he had been quite young at the time. Charles chuckled and said it was a shame, since apparently he and a little girl from the Bennett family used to be inseparable during those summer visits, always running off together the moment the adults began discussing business. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward through Ethan's chest. He glanced across the room toward Ava, who stood near the window speaking with another guest, her posture suddenly a little too still, as though she had heard the conversation despite the distance between them. Charles moved on to another topic, unaware of the effect his casual comment had produced, but Ethan barely heard another word for the rest of the evening, his mind spinning backward through fragments of memory he could not quite piece together. On the drive home, he asked Ava directly whether she had known him as a child, whether the Bennett family Charles mentioned was truly her own. Ava was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the passing streetlights, before finally admitting in a voice barely above a whisper that yes, they had known each other once, a long time ago, though she was not certain he would remember any of it, and she had not wanted to be the one to bring it up first. Ethan felt something crack open inside his chest. A door he had not realized was locked suddenly swinging free. He asked her to tell him everything, and Ava hesitated, glancing at him with an expression caught somewhere between hope and fear, before finally beginning to speak, her voice trembling slightly as she described a lake house from decades earlier, a summer spent running through tall grass and jumping from a wooden dock into cool water, and a friendship between two children that had felt, at the time, like it would last forever. He listened in silence, straining to remember, catching only fragments, the smell of pine trees, the sound of laughter carried across water, a small hand gripping his own as they raced down a hill together. The images were faint, distant, like photographs left too long in a drawer, their colors faded almost beyond recognition. He wanted desperately to remember more, to reach back through the years and pull the entire memory into focus, but it remained frustratingly out of reach, leaving him with only the aching certainty that something important had once existed between them, something he had somehow, impossibly, allowed himself to forget. Ava fell silent after finishing her story, watching him carefully, waiting to see how he would respond. Ethan reached across the car and took her hand, an instinctive gesture that surprised them both, and told her honestly that he could not remember everything, but that something in him recognized the truth of what she was describing, a feeling too deep and too persistent to be coincidence. Ava's eyes glistened in the dim light of passing street lamps, and she said quietly that she had waited a long time to hear him say even that much. Neither of them spoke again for the rest of the drive, but the silence between them had changed entirely, no longer distant and guarded, but heavy with unspoken history and the fragile beginning of something neither of them had expected to find inside a marriage built on obligation. When they arrived home, Ethan walked her to her door as he always did, but this time he lingered a moment longer, studying her face in the dim hallway light, searching for the child she had once been, hidden somewhere beneath the composed woman standing before him now. Ava met his gaze steadily, neither of them moving, until finally she offered a small, sad smile and said good night, disappearing into her room before he could find the words to say anything else. Ethan stood alone in the hallway for a long time afterward, replaying Charles Whitmore's careless comment over and over in his mind, along with the fragments of memory it had unlocked. He thought about his father, about the shipping business that had connected their two families decades earlier, about the strange twist of fate that had brought Ava back into his life through nothing more than an old, unpaid debt. He wondered how much more of the past remained buried, waiting to be uncovered, and whether he truly wanted to know all of it, or whether some part of him had been avoiding the truth for reasons he did not yet fully understand. He climbed the stairs slowly, aware that something fundamental had shifted that night, a quiet crack forming in the careful wall he had built around himself since his father's death. For the first time since signing those papers in Gerald Ashworth's cold office, the marriage no longer felt entirely like an obligation. It felt, faintly and unmistakably, like the beginning of something he had lost a very long time ago, something he was only now beginning to understand he desperately wanted back. The following weekend, Ethan finally forced himself to return to his father's study, a room he had avoided since the funeral, its shelves still lined with unread files and forgotten mementos. He had promised the accountant he would sort through the remaining paperwork before the estate could be fully closed, but every time he opened the door, the weight of his father's absence pressed down on him so heavily that he found an excuse to leave again within minutes. This time, he told himself he would not walk away until the job was done. Ava offered to help, and though he almost refused out of habit, something made him accept instead. They worked together through the afternoon, sorting old contracts into neat piles, setting aside anything that looked personal rather than financial. Ava handled the task with quiet efficiency, occasionally pausing to ask a question about a name or a date, never intruding further than necessary, respecting the private grief that still lingered in every corner of the room. It was Ethan who found the box, tucked behind a row of dusty ledgers on the bottom shelf, its cardboard corners soft with age. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, curling slightly at the edges, images of his father as a younger man, standing beside another man Ethan did not immediately recognize. The two of them laughing together on the deck of a boat, tools scattered around them, crates of cargo stacked in the background. He flipped through several photographs, before pausing on one that made his breath catch in his throat. It showed a lake, sunlight scattering across the water exactly the way it had appeared in his recent dreams, and standing at the edge of a wooden dock were two children, a boy who could only have been himself around the age of 7, and a girl with dark hair and a gap-toothed smile, her hand clasped tightly in his. Both children were laughing at something outside the frame, caught in a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. Ethan stared at the photograph for a long moment, his chest tightening, before turning it over to find a note written in his father's careful handwriting. The note read simply, Ethan and Ava, summer at the lake house, and beneath it, a date from more than 20 years earlier. He sat frozen, staring at the words, the photograph trembling slightly in his hand. Ava, sorting through a nearby stack of papers, noticed his stillness and moved closer, glancing over his shoulder at what he held. Her breath caught audibly when she saw the image, and she reached out with careful fingers to take the photograph, studying it with an expression of quiet wonder, as though seeing a piece of her own childhood confirmed in physical form for the first time. She confirmed, in a voice thick with emotion, that yes, this was them, taken during the last summer they had spent together at the lake house before her father's falling out with his father had ended the partnership, and along with it, the friendship between their families. She explained that afterward, her family had moved away suddenly, the business venture collapsing amid accusations neither side ever fully clarified to her satisfaction, and she had never seen him again after that final summer. Ethan asked what had happened between their fathers, and Ava admitted she did not know the full story, only fragments overheard as a child, arguments about money and trust, accusations of dishonesty thrown between two men who had once considered each other close friends. Whatever the cause, the friendship had ended abruptly, and with it, any connection between the two families, until Gerald Ashworth resurrected the old debt years later and forced their lives back together through the strange mechanism of an arranged marriage. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the remaining photographs together, piecing together a shared history neither of them had fully understood until that moment. There were images of birthday parties, of afternoons spent building sandcastles, of two children racing bicycles down a gravel road, their faces bright with the uncomplicated happiness of youth. Ethan found himself staring at each photograph with a growing ache in his chest, mourning a friendship he had somehow completely forgotten, wondering how something so clearly important could have simply vanished from his memory. Ava explained, gently, that children often forgot painful separations, especially when the adults around them never spoke of what had happened afterward, allowing the memory to fade quietly rather than confronting the loss directly. His father, she suggested, had likely never mentioned the friendship again after the falling out, and without any reminder to keep the memory alive. A young Ethan had simply let it slip away over the years, the way unused paths through a forest slowly become overgrown and impossible to find. The explanation made sense, though it did little to ease the ache building steadily in his chest. He asked Ava if she remembered anything else, anything that might explain the debt Gerald had used to force their marriage, and she hesitated before admitting that she recalled overhearing her father, in the weeks before their sudden move, mention something about a promise, a private arrangement between the two families that had nothing to do with money at all. Curious and increasingly unsettled, Ethan pressed further, but Ava admitted she had only been a child at the time, too young to fully understand the adult conversations happening around her, and the details had faded over the years into vague impressions rather than clear memories. She promised to try to remember more, though her expression suggested the effort would not be easy, the past clearly holding weight for her that went beyond simple curiosity. That evening, unable to let the mystery rest, Ethan called Gerald Ashworth directly, demanding to know the true origin of the debt that had bound him to Ava in marriage. Gerald's response was evasive at first, deflecting with vague references to old business dealings, but Ethan pressed harder, mentioning the photograph, the shared childhood, the promise Ava vaguely remembered her father discussing. There was a long pause on the line before Gerald finally admitted, reluctantly, that the debt was not purely financial in nature. According to Gerald, the original agreement between the two fathers had included a personal element alongside the business loan, a private understanding that if circumstances ever forced their families apart, their children would one day be reunited, whether through friendship or, if fate allowed, through something deeper. The fathers had apparently discussed the possibility of an eventual marriage between Ethan and Ava even as children, half in jest at the time, though the idea had clearly taken root seriously enough to be woven into the legal language of their business agreement, buried beneath layers of financial terminology that made it appear, to any outside observer, like a simple contractual obligation. Ethan sat in stunned silence after ending the call, staring blankly at the wall of his study. The marriage he had believed to be a cold, transactional arrangement, forced upon him purely to save his father's company, had actually been rooted in something far older and far more personal, a promise made between two friends decades earlier, quietly waiting to be fulfilled long after both men had passed from the world that created it. He found Ava in the kitchen and told her everything Gerald had revealed. She listened with growing astonishment, her hand rising slowly to cover her mouth as the pieces of her own scattered childhood memories finally clicked into place. She admitted, through tears she seemed embarrassed to be shedding, that some small part of her had always suspected there was more to their arranged marriage than mere financial necessity, though she had never dared hope the truth might be something so deeply personal, so clearly rooted in the friendship they had shared as children. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the kitchen silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain beginning against the windows. Ethan studied her face, searching once again for the child from the photograph, and this time, perhaps because he finally understood the truth, he found her there clearly, the same warmth in her eyes, the same steady determination in the set of her jaw. He asked quietly why she had never told him any of this from the beginning, why she had allowed him to believe their marriage was nothing more than an obligation forced upon them by circumstance. Ava's expression clouded with old hurt as she explained that she had recognized him immediately, the very first time they met in Gerald's office, but had assumed, given his obvious confusion and his complete lack of recognition, that he had simply forgotten her entirely, that whatever their fathers had once hoped for meant nothing to him now. She had not wanted to burden him with a truth that might only complicate an already difficult situation, choosing instead to remain quiet and let him adjust to their marriage at his own pace. Her explanation, though understandable, left Ethan with a heavy mixture of guilt and regret. He apologized for forgetting her, for allowing the years and the distance to erase something that had clearly meant so much to both their fathers, and to her as well. Ava accepted his apology gently, though her eyes remained shadowed with an old sadness he suspected ran far deeper than she was willing to reveal in that moment. They sat together at the kitchen table long after the rain had stopped, talking quietly about the fragments of memory each of them still carried, piecing together, slowly and carefully, a childhood friendship neither of them had realized was still influencing their present lives in such profound ways. Ethan found himself, for the first time since his father's death, genuinely curious about the future rather than simply enduring it, wondering what it might mean to rebuild something so completely forgotten, and whether 2 years of obligation might, against all odds, grow into something neither of them had dared to imagine possible. Before they finally said goodnight, Ava mentioned, almost hesitantly, that she still had one item from that final summer at the lake house, something her father had given her just before their sudden departure, though she had never fully understood its significance until now. She promised to show him the following day, and Ethan spent the rest of the night lying awake, his mind spinning with questions, unable to shake the growing sense that the promise buried in his father's old contract was about to reveal itself as something far more meaningful than either of them had originally understood. The next morning, before Ethan left for work, Ava asked him to wait a few extra minutes, disappearing briefly into her room before returning with a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. She set it carefully on the kitchen table and opened the lid, revealing a thin silver chain with a small charm shaped like a tiny lighthouse, the metal slightly tarnished with age. She explained that her father had given it to her the night before their sudden departure from the lake house, telling her to keep it safe, that it represented a promise made between two families that would one day matter more than she could understand as a child. She had worn it constantly for years afterward, though eventually, as the memory of that final summer faded into something distant and unclear, she had put it away, unable to fully explain why she still felt compelled to keep it rather than let it go entirely. Ethan stared at the small charm, and slowly, almost involuntarily, a memory surfaced with startling clarity. He remembered standing on the wooden dock, fumbling with the clasp of a similar chain, struggling to fasten it around a smaller wrist while a girl giggled at his clumsy attempts. He remembered his father laughing nearby, telling them both that the lighthouse charms were meant to be a pair, one for each of them, symbols of a promise made between their families that they would always find their way back to each other, no matter how far apart life might eventually take them. He asked Ava, his voice unsteady, whether he had once worn a matching charm, and her eyes widened slightly before she nodded, confirming that yes, both children had received identical lighthouse pendants that final summer, gifts from their fathers meant to seal an informal promise between the two families. Ethan felt something shift deep inside his chest, a piece of the puzzle sliding firmly into place. He excused himself and hurried to his own bedroom, digging through an old box of childhood belongings he had never bothered to unpack since moving into the house years earlier. After several minutes of searching, his fingers closed around a small, tarnished chain tucked into the corner of an old cigar box, forgotten among ticket stubs and outgrown watch straps. He returned to the kitchen and set his own lighthouse charm beside Ava's on the table, the two pendants nearly identical, weathered by decades of neglect but unmistakably matching pieces of the same set. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, simply staring at the two small charms resting side by side. Ava reached out first, her fingers brushing gently against the tarnished metal, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She admitted quietly that she had never truly believed she would see the matching charm again, that some part of her had assumed Ethan had thrown his away years earlier, another childhood memory discarded and forgotten along with everything else from that final summer. Ethan found himself unable to look away from her, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressing down on him with sudden, overwhelming clarity. Their fathers had not simply signed a random contract to formalize a random loan. They had built something intentional, a promise meant to outlast both their business partnership and their own lifetimes, a hope that their children might someday find their way back to each other, exactly as fate seemed to have finally arranged. He was late for work that morning, though for the first time since his father's death, the delay did not bother him in the slightest. He called his assistant, explained he would arrive later than usual, and spent an extra hour sitting with Ava in the quiet kitchen, both of them turning the small charms over in their hands, exchanging fragments of memory as they slowly returned, piece by piece, filling in details neither had realized the other still carried somewhere deep inside. Ava remembered a treehouse they had built together using scrap wood from the lake house's old boathouse, its structure crooked and unstable, but somehow, in their eyes as children, the most magnificent fortress imaginable. Ethan remembered, in turn, a thunderstorm that had trapped them both inside that same treehouse, how frightened Ava had been of the lightning, and how he had held her hand tightly through the entire storm, promising over and over that he would never let anything hurt her. The memories, once they began returning, seemed to build upon each other with increasing speed, each fragment unlocking another, until Ethan felt almost overwhelmed by the sheer volume of forgotten history suddenly flooding back into his conscious mind. He marveled at how completely he had buried an entire summer, an entire friendship, beneath the accumulated weight of adulthood and loss, and he found himself wondering what else from his past remained hidden, waiting patiently for the right trigger to bring it rushing back to the surface. That evening, Ethan finally worked up the courage to ask his mother directly about the summer at the lake house, hoping she might fill in additional details neither he nor Ava could fully recall. Margaret answered the phone sounding surprised by the question, admitting she remembered the trips vaguely, though she had never paid close attention to the children's friendship at the time, focused instead on the business negotiations happening between their fathers. She did recall, however, that his father had spoken fondly of the Bennett family for years afterward, even after the falling out, sometimes mentioning with quiet regret that he wished circumstances had allowed the friendship between the families to continue uninterrupted. Margaret's tone softened as she spoke, a rare gentleness entering her voice that Ethan had not heard from her in a very long time. She admitted that she had misjudged Ava during their first meeting, assuming the marriage was purely a calculated arrangement on the younger woman's part, and that hearing this new context changed her understanding of the situation considerably. She promised to visit again soon, this time with a more open mind, and Ethan felt a small, unexpected warmth at the idea that his mother's opinion of Ava might finally begin to shift toward something kinder. After ending the call, Ethan found Ava in the living room, curled into the corner of the sofa with a book she did not appear to actually be reading, her attention clearly elsewhere. He sat down beside her, closer than he might have a week earlier, and told her about the conversation with his mother, watching relief and cautious hope flicker across her expression as he spoke. She admitted that she had been anxious about how Margaret perceived her, worried that the older woman's initial coldness might never fully thaw, and hearing that things could change meant more to her than he perhaps realized. They sat together for the rest of the evening, the television playing quietly in the background though neither of them paid it much attention, both lost instead in quiet conversation about the past, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them back together after so many years apart, about the promise their fathers had made that now, against every expectation Ethan had walked into this marriage with, seemed to be slowly and steadily coming true. Before heading to bed, Ava asked, somewhat shyly, whether he intended to keep wearing the lighthouse charm now that he had found it again. Ethan looked down at the small pendant still resting in his palm, its tarnished surface catching the dim lamp light, and told her honestly that he could not imagine putting it away again, not after everything it now represented. He watched her fasten her own chain around her neck before he did the same, the small charm settling against his chest with a weight that felt, despite its tiny size, remarkably significant. That night, for the first time since the wedding, Ethan fell asleep without the persistent unease that had shadowed him through every previous evening in the house. His dreams, when they came, were vivid and warm, filled with sunlight on water, laughter echoing across a wooden dock, and a small hand gripped tightly in his own. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he woke feeling not haunted by the past, but comforted by it, as though a wound he had not even realized he was carrying had finally, quietly, begun to heal. The peace did not last long. 10 days later, Gerald Ashworth arrived at the house unannounced, his expression carrying none of the polite formality he had shown during their first meeting. He refused Ava's offer of tea, choosing instead to stand stiffly in the living room while he explained that the original agreement contained an additional clause neither Ethan nor Ava had been made fully aware of during the signing. According to Gerald, the loan included a provision allowing him to request early repayment if he believed the marriage was not being conducted in good faith, a vague enough condition that he could interpret almost any circumstance to suit his own purposes. Ethan felt his jaw tighten as Gerald spoke, sensing immediately that the man had not come simply to check on their well-being. Gerald continued, explaining that a rival shipping company had recently approached him with an offer to buy out the remaining debt entirely, at a price significantly higher than the original loan amount, provided Gerald could deliver Ethan's company along with it. He suggested, with the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to treating people as assets rather than individuals, that dissolving the marriage now, quietly and without complication, might actually work in everyone's favor financially, leaving Ethan free of obligation while allowing Gerald to collect a considerably larger payout. The suggestion landed in the room like a blow. Ethan stood abruptly, demanding to know whether Gerald had orchestrated the entire marriage purely as a financial maneuver, using both his and Ava's lives as pawns in a business transaction that had nothing to do with the promise their fathers had made decades earlier. Gerald's expression flickered, something almost like guilt crossing his features before he masked it with practiced indifference, admitting that while the original clause had indeed been rooted in the old friendship between the fathers, he had no obligation to honor sentimental history when a more profitable opportunity presented itself. Ava, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tension radiating through the room. She reminded Gerald that the agreement had been built on trust between two families, that using it now as leverage for a rival business deal betrayed everything her own father and Ethan's father had intended when they first drafted the terms. Gerald waved off her objection, stating flatly that sentiment did not pay bills, and that he expected an answer regarding the buyout offer within the week. After Gerald left, the house fell into a heavy, uneasy silence. Ethan paced the length of the living room, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just heard. If Gerald sold the debt to a rival company, that company would gain significant leverage over his own business, potentially forcing a merger or acquisition under terms far less favorable than anything he had originally agreed to. Worse, the entire foundation of his marriage now felt suddenly precarious, threatened by forces entirely outside his control. Ava sat quietly on the sofa, watching him pace, her expression difficult to read. When he finally stopped and looked at her, she asked, in a small voice, whether he was considering accepting Gerald's suggestion, dissolving the marriage now that its original financial purpose could apparently be fulfilled through other means. The question caught him off guard, and he realized, with a flicker of guilt, that he had been so focused on the business implications that he had not stopped to consider how the conversation might have affected her. He crossed the room and sat beside her, taking her hand gently, and told her honestly that dissolving the marriage had not crossed his mind, not after everything they had rediscovered together over the past few weeks. He admitted that the sudden threat from Gerald had rattled him, forcing him to confront how fragile their situation truly was, built as it was on a legal agreement that could apparently be reshaped or exploited whenever it suited someone else's financial interests. Ava's shoulders relaxed slightly at his words, though worry still lingered clearly in her eyes. Over the following days, Ethan threw himself into researching the legal details of the original contract, determined to find a way to protect both his company and his marriage from Gerald's manipulation. He consulted with a different lawyer, one unconnected to the Ashworth family, who confirmed that the early repayment clause Gerald had mentioned was indeed real, though vaguely worded enough that it could potentially be challenged in court if Ethan chose to fight it. The lawyer warned, however, that any legal battle would likely take months to resolve, during which time the uncertainty could seriously damage investor confidence in his company. Frustrated by the lack of a clean solution, Ethan found himself increasingly on edge, snapping at minor inconveniences, staying later at the office than usual as he searched for alternative financing that might allow him to pay off the debt entirely and remove Gerald's leverage once and for all. Ava, sensing his growing stress, tried to offer support where she could, though the pressure of the situation began to strain even their newly rebuilt connection, both of them retreating slightly into old habits of guarded distance whenever the weight of the threat became too heavy to discuss openly. One evening, arriving home later than usual after another unsuccessful meeting with potential investors, Ethan found Ava sitting alone in the darkened kitchen, a cup of untouched tea cooling in front of her. She admitted, when he asked what was wrong, that she had received a call from her own mother that afternoon, informing her that Gerald had visited their family as well, hinting that if the marriage dissolved, there might be consequences for the modest financial support Gerald currently provided her aging parents. A quiet arrangement Ava had never fully explained to Ethan until that moment. The revelation struck Ethan hard, both because it revealed yet another layer of Gerald's manipulation, and because it meant Ava had been carrying additional pressure entirely on her own, afraid perhaps that admitting her family's financial dependence on Gerald would make her seem less trustworthy in Ethan's eyes. He assured her immediately that he did not think less of her for it, that everyone carried burdens they did not always share right away, and that they would find a way through the situation together, as partners rather than as two people simply enduring a shared obligation. Ava's eyes filled with tears at his reassurance, and she admitted quietly that she had spent so many years believing she had to handle every difficulty alone, first after her family's sudden departure from the lake house all those years ago, and later through the quiet, unglamorous struggle of watching her parents' finances slowly decline, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone genuinely willing to share the weight of a problem rather than simply watch from a distance. Her admission opened something between them that had remained carefully guarded even through their rediscovered childhood connection. Ethan realized that while they had reclaimed a beautiful piece of shared history, they had not yet built the deeper trust required to face present difficulties together as equal partners. He resolved, sitting with her in the quiet kitchen that evening, to change that immediately, promising that from that point forward, he wanted her honest involvement in every decision affecting their shared future, rather than allowing either of them to carry burdens silently out of misplaced protectiveness. They spent the rest of the night working through the situation together, mapping out possible strategies, discussing which investors might be willing to help refinance the debt on more favorable terms, considering whether Ethan's company held any assets that could be liquidated quickly enough to satisfy Gerald's demand without triggering the disastrous fire sale threatened during their initial meeting. Ava, drawing on business instincts she had developed while helping manage her own family's dwindling finances over the years, offered insights Ethan had not considered, spotting inefficiencies in his company's structure that, if addressed quickly, might free up enough capital to make Gerald's rival buyout offer considerably less attractive. By the time they finally went to bed, exhausted but oddly energized by the collaborative effort, Ethan felt something had shifted permanently between them. The threat from Gerald remained unresolved, looming over their immediate future with genuine danger to both his company and the fragile new trust they had built together. But for the first time since the wedding, Ethan felt certain that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would not be facing them alone, and neither would she. The following morning, before leaving for another round of investor meetings, Ethan paused at the door and turned back to look at Ava, who stood in the kitchen doorway watching him go, the small lighthouse charm still resting against her collarbone exactly as it had every day since they rediscovered the matching pendants. He crossed the room, kissed her forehead gently, a small gesture that surprised them both with its easy tenderness, and told her that whatever Gerald threw at them next, they would handle it together, exactly as their fathers had once hoped decades earlier, two families quietly bound not by money, but by a promise neither generation had ever truly forgotten. Gerald's deadline arrived faster than either of them expected. On a gray Thursday morning, Ethan received a formal notice from a company called Harrow Maritime, informing him that they had purchased the outstanding debt from Gerald Ashworth, and now held full legal authority over the terms of repayment. The letter was cold and precise, stating that Harrow Maritime expected either immediate repayment in full, an amount that would cripple his company overnight, or a controlling stake in his business in exchange for extended terms, a proposal that would strip Ethan of any real authority over the company his father had spent a lifetime building. He called Gerald immediately, furious, only to be met with a clipped, almost bored response confirming that the sale had gone through exactly as warned, and that Gerald considered the matter no longer his concern. Ethan slammed the phone down, his hands shaking with anger, and spent the rest of the morning locked in his study, poring over the notice again and again, searching for any legal loophole that might slow Harrow Maritime's aggressive timeline. When Ava returned from running errands that afternoon, she found him still hunched over his desk, surrounded by scattered papers, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and stress. She asked what had happened, and when he explained the situation, her face drained of color, understanding immediately the scale of the threat now facing them. She sat down beside him and began reading through the notice herself, occasionally asking sharp, practical questions about the specific language used in the document, questions that revealed an instinct for detail Ethan had not fully appreciated until that moment. Over the following days, tension in the house grew thick and difficult to navigate. Ethan spent long hours meeting with lawyers and potential investors, desperate to find a way to either pay off the debt or negotiate more favorable terms with Harrow Maritime before their deadline expired. Ava, meanwhile, reached out quietly to old contacts from her father's shipping days, hoping someone might remember enough about the original business dealings to help clarify the legal standing of the debt, or perhaps even identify a weakness in Harrow Maritime's claim. It was during this stressful period that the first real crack appeared in their fragile new trust. Ava, without telling Ethan first, arranged a meeting with a former colleague of her father's who claimed to have information that might help their case. The meeting ran late, and when she finally returned home well past dinner, exhausted and preoccupied, she found Ethan waiting in the kitchen, his expression a mixture of worry and barely restrained frustration. He asked where she had been, and when she explained the meeting, admitting she had not mentioned it beforehand because she had wanted to avoid distracting him with a lead that might turn out to be nothing, Ethan's frustration boiled over unexpectedly. He reminded her, his voice sharper than he intended, that he had asked her only days earlier to be honest and involved in every decision, and that disappearing for hours without warning during such a critical time felt like exactly the kind of secrecy he had hoped they were moving past together. Ava, stung by the accusation, countered that she had been trying to help, that not every action required his prior approval, and that his reaction felt less like genuine concern and more like an attempt to control her movements during a time when she had simply been trying to contribute something useful to their shared problem. The argument escalated quickly, both of them exhausted and raw from weeks of mounting pressure, old insecurities surfacing beneath the surface of their words. Ethan accused her of still keeping secrets, a habit she had displayed from their very first meeting in Gerald's office. Ava, in turn, accused him of expecting perfect transparency from her, while he himself had spent the early weeks of their marriage treating her with cold distance, offering nothing of himself until circumstances forced his hand. The words hung heavy in the air between them, both regretting the harshness even as they spoke, yet neither willing to back down in the heat of the moment. Ava finally turned and walked upstairs without another word, closing her bedroom door with a soft but unmistakable finality that felt, to Ethan standing alone in the kitchen, far more devastating than if she had slammed it. He remained downstairs for a long time afterward, replaying the argument in his mind, recognizing with growing discomfort that his reaction had been driven less by genuine concern for her safety and more by an old fear resurfacing. The fear of being deceived, of investing trust in someone only to discover later that they had been hiding something important all along. He understood, intellectually, that Ava's meeting had been motivated by genuine care for their shared situation. Yet the sting of feeling excluded had triggered something deeper and more painful, rooted perhaps in the abrupt loss of their childhood friendship decades earlier. A wound he had not even realized still lingered somewhere beneath the surface. The following days passed with a strained, careful politeness between them, both moving through the house with the practiced distance of people determined not to reopen a painful argument, yet unable to fully bridge the gap it had created. Ava continued pursuing her own leads regarding the debt, though now she reported back to Ethan each evening with meticulous detail, and Ethan, aware of his own overreaction, made a conscious effort to listen without judgment, though the easy warmth that had characterized their recent weeks together remained noticeably absent. Meanwhile, the pressure from Harrow Maritime intensified. a representative from the company, a sharp-featured man named Douglas Kent, arrived at Ethan's office demanding an answer within 72 hours, hinting none too subtly that failure to comply would result in immediate legal action to seize company assets. Ethan left the meeting shaken, the reality of the threat settling over him with crushing weight, and for the first time since inheriting his father's company, he seriously considered the possibility that everything might genuinely be lost, regardless of how hard he fought to save it. That evening, arriving home emotionally and physically exhausted, Ethan found the house unusually quiet. He searched the downstairs rooms before finally finding Ava in the study, surrounded by a spread of old documents she had gathered from her contacts, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and cautious excitement. She explained that her father's former colleague had located an old ledger, proving that the original loan between their fathers had already been partially repaid decades earlier through a series of informal arrangements never properly recorded in the official paperwork, meaning the debt Harrow Maritime now claimed was likely inflated far beyond its legitimate value. The discovery offered a genuine glimmer of hope, a potential legal angle that could significantly reduce or even nullify the debt entirely if properly verified and presented in court. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude and relief so overwhelming that he crossed the room without thinking and pulled Ava into an embrace, the argument from days earlier momentarily forgotten in the face of shared triumph. She stiffened for a brief moment, still carrying the hurt from their earlier exchange, before slowly relaxing into the embrace, her arms wrapping around him in return. They stayed like that for a long moment, the weight of weeks of stress finally beginning to lift, if only slightly. When they finally separated, Ethan apologized properly for his reaction days earlier, admitting that his fear of being deceived had clouded his judgment, that he recognized her actions had been motivated entirely by care rather than secrecy, and that he wanted, moving forward, to trust her instincts as fully as he trusted his own. Ava accepted the apology gently, admitting in turn that she understood his fear better than he perhaps realized, having spent years herself struggling to trust people fully after her own family's sudden, unexplained departure from the life and friendships she had known as a child. Their reconciliation, though genuine, did not erase the underlying anxiety still hanging over their situation. The newly discovered evidence needed to be verified and properly presented to a judge before it could offer any real protection against Harrow Maritime's aggressive timeline, a process that would take time they were not certain they still had. Ethan spent the following morning consulting urgently with his lawyer, presenting the newly discovered ledger, and requesting an emergency injunction to delay any asset seizure, while the evidence underwent proper legal review. The lawyer, cautiously optimistic, agreed to file the request immediately, though he warned that judges did not always grant such injunctions quickly, and that Harrow Maritime's legal team would almost certainly fight aggressively against any delay to their timeline. Ethan returned home that evening carrying both renewed hope and persistent uncertainty, uncertain whether the fragile lead Ava had uncovered would prove strong enough to save everything his father had built, or whether it would simply delay an inevitable collapse by a few precious weeks. That night, as they sat together reviewing the ledger one final time before submitting it to the court the following morning, Ava reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that felt, after everything they had endured together over the past weeks, less like comfort offered between strangers and more like the quiet, steady support shared between two people who had finally, truly, chosen to face whatever came next side by side, regardless of the outcome awaiting them in the days ahead. The court hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving Ethan's legal team barely enough time to verify the ledger and prepare a formal argument. The days leading up to it passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and increasingly sleepless nights. Both Ethan and Ava stretched thin by the mounting pressure. Despite the exhaustion, something had solidified between them since their reconciliation, a quiet partnership that carried them through each difficult day with a steadiness neither had expected to find inside a marriage that began as nothing more than a legal obligation. 3 days before the hearing, disaster struck from an entirely unexpected direction. Ava collapsed suddenly in the kitchen one evening, her hand flying to her side moments before her legs gave out beneath her. Ethan, working nearby in the study, heard the crash of a dropped mug and rushed in to find her crumpled on the floor, pale and struggling to breathe, a sharp pain evidently radiating through her abdomen. He called for emergency help immediately, his hands trembling as he knelt beside her, holding her steady, repeating her name over and over, terror gripping his chest in a way he had never experienced before, not even during the darkest moments of his father's illness. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly, eventually determining that Ava had suffered a burst appendix, the inflammation likely building silently for days while she pushed through exhaustion and stress, without recognizing the warning signs her body had been sending. The condition required immediate surgery, and Ethan was left alone in a sterile waiting room, staring blankly at the wall clock, the ledger and the court hearing and Harrow Maritime's aggressive deadline suddenly feeling meaningless against the far more immediate fear of losing the person who had, over the past weeks, become far more important to him than he had ever expected possible. He thought, sitting in that quiet waiting room, about every moment of distance he had maintained during the early weeks of their marriage, every guarded conversation, every night he had retreated to his study, rather than allowing himself to grow closer to her. He thought about the childhood friendship he had forgotten so completely that it took a stranger's careless comment and a box of old photographs to remind him it had ever existed at all. He thought about the recent argument, born of his own old fears, and how easily he had let a single misunderstanding threaten the fragile trust they had worked so hard to rebuild. Sitting there, waiting for news, Ethan finally allowed himself to fully acknowledge what he had been avoiding admitting even to himself throughout the past several weeks. He was not simply fulfilling an obligation anymore, not merely honoring a promise made by their fathers decades earlier out of a sense of duty or nostalgia. He had genuinely, completely fallen in love with her, not the vague, half-remembered child from his forgotten summer, but the steady, resourceful, quietly courageous woman she had grown into, the woman currently fighting for her life in an operating room down the hall while he sat helpless, desperate for any word of her condition. The surgery took nearly 3 hours. When the doctor finally emerged, informing him that the procedure had gone well, and that Ava was expected to make a full recovery, Ethan felt his knees nearly buckle with relief, a wave of emotion crashing over him so intensely that he had to steady himself against the wall for a moment before he could properly thank the doctor and ask when he might be able to see her. He sat beside her hospital bed for the rest of the night, holding her hand as she slowly emerged from the anesthesia, her eyes fluttering open occasionally before drifting closed again. When she finally woke fully, disoriented and groggy, her first question, barely audible, was whether the ledger had been submitted on time for the hearing. Ethan felt something crack open in his chest at the question, overwhelmed that even in her weakened state, her first thought had been for their shared fight to save his father's company, rather than for herself. He assured her gently that the hearing could wait, that nothing mattered more right now than her recovery, and Ava, despite her exhaustion, managed a small, tired smile, telling him that she appreciated the sentiment but that she fully intended to be there for the hearing regardless, propped up on painkillers if necessary, because she refused to let Harrow Maritime win by default while she recovered in a hospital bed. Her stubborn determination, even in that vulnerable moment, only deepened the certainty already settling firmly in Ethan's heart. He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, telling her, his voice thick with emotion he no longer felt any need to hide, that he loved her not out of obligation, not simply because of a promise their fathers had made decades earlier, but because of exactly who she had shown herself to be throughout every difficult moment of the past several weeks. Ava's eyes filled with tears at his words, and she admitted quietly that she had loved him since the moment she recognized him in Gerald's office, though she had been too afraid to say it aloud, uncertain whether he would ever be able to feel the same way in return. The court hearing ultimately proceeded without her, the doctors firmly refusing to release her in time despite her protests, though Ethan kept her updated by phone throughout the tense proceedings. The judge, presented with the verified ledger evidence proving the original debt had already been substantially repaid decades earlier, ruled in Ethan's favor, significantly reducing the amount Harrow Maritime could legally claim and granting an extended timeline for the remaining balance, more than enough breathing room for Ethan's company to stabilize and arrange proper long-term financing. When Ethan called Ava with the news, her relieved laughter through the phone, still weak from the surgery but unmistakably joyful, felt to him like the single best sound he had ever heard. He rushed back to the hospital immediately, arriving to find her sitting up in bed, color returning steadily to her face. And when he told her every detail of the hearing, she listened with rapt attention, occasionally squeezing his hand in celebration at each favorable turn of the proceedings. In the days that followed, as Ava slowly recovered at home under Ethan's careful attention, the atmosphere in the house transformed completely from the guarded uncertainty of their earliest weeks together into something warm and unmistakably rooted in genuine partnership. Ethan took time away from the office, something he had rarely done even before his father's death, choosing instead to sit with Ava through long, quiet afternoons, reading to her when she grew tired, listening as she shared more and more memories from their forgotten childhood friendship, each fragment adding richness to a history he now cherished rather than mourned. Margaret visited twice during Ava's recovery, her demeanor noticeably softer than during their first tense meeting, bringing homemade soup and sitting with Ava for hours, the two women slowly building an unexpected friendship of their own. Even Gerald Ashworth, upon hearing of the court's ruling and Ava's health scare, sent a brief, uncharacteristically humble note expressing relief at her recovery, though Ethan remained cautious about trusting the man's motives going forward, unwilling to forget how easily Gerald had been willing to weaponize their marriage for personal profit. As Ava's strength gradually returned, she and Ethan began spending long evenings talking about the future, no longer burdened by the immediate threat of losing everything, finally able to imagine what their life together might genuinely look like once the remaining debt was fully settled and the shadow of obligation lifted entirely from their marriage. Ethan found himself, for the first time since his father's death, looking forward eagerly to each new day rather than simply enduring it, grateful beyond measure for the strange, unlikely chain of events that had led him back to the childhood promise he had once completely forgotten, and grateful even more for the woman who had waited patiently, through years of separation and uncertainty, for him to finally remember it. 6 weeks after the court ruling, with Ava fully recovered and Ethan's company finally stabilized under a new, manageable repayment plan, Ethan arranged a private financing deal through one of the investors who had shown interest during their earlier fundraising efforts, using the fresh capital to pay off the remaining balance of the original debt entirely, severing any lingering connection to Gerald Ashworth or Harrow Maritime once and for all. When he informed Ava the debt had been fully settled, she cried openly, relief washing over her features as she realized the strange, complicated arrangement that had first brought them together no longer held any power over their future. That evening, sitting together on the back porch overlooking the quiet garden, Ethan told her he wanted to take her somewhere, a surprise he had been planning quietly for the past week. Ava, curious and a little wary given how many surprises life had thrown at them recently, agreed nonetheless, and 2 days later, they found themselves driving several hours outside the city, the landscape gradually shifting from busy streets into rolling hills and quiet countryside roads. She realized where they were headed before he said anything, her breath catching as familiar landmarks began appearing along the route. A bend in the road she somehow still remembered, a cluster of tall pine trees that triggered a rush of childhood recognition. When they finally arrived, the lake spread out before them exactly as it had appeared in both their memories and the old photographs from his father's study, sunlight scattering brilliantly across the water's surface, the wooden dock still standing, weathered but intact at the water's edge. Ethan had contacted the current owners weeks earlier, a retired couple who had purchased the property long after Ava's family departed decades ago, and arranged for them to spend the afternoon there privately. Ava stepped out of the car slowly, tears already forming as she took in the familiar scenery, walking toward the dock with an expression caught somewhere between overwhelming joy and lingering grief for all the years they had spent apart, unable to share this place, unable even to remember, in his case, that it had ever existed. They walked together along the shoreline, retracing paths their younger selves had once run down without a single worry, Ava pointing out spots that triggered vivid memories, the exact tree they had once tried to climb, the shallow section of water where they had spent entire afternoons searching for smooth stones. Ethan listened intently to each story, contributing pieces of his own increasingly clear memories, the two of them slowly reconstructing an entire summer neither had realized. Until recently, they still carried so completely within themselves. At the end of the dock, exactly where the old photograph had been taken decades earlier, Ethan stopped and turned to face her, reaching into his jacket pocket for a small box he had been carrying carefully throughout the entire drive. He explained that while their marriage had begun through obligation, through a debt, and a contract neither of them had chosen, everything that mattered most about their relationship now had nothing to do with any of that. He told her that he wanted to marry her again, properly this time, not because of a promise made by their fathers decades earlier, not because of any legal necessity, but simply because he loved her, completely and without reservation, and wanted the entire world to know it. He opened the box to reveal a ring, its design deliberately simple, and nestled beside it, a small silver charm shaped like a lighthouse, identical to the ones they both already wore. A symbol he had commissioned specifically to complete the pair that had once represented their father's hopeful promise, and now represented something far more personal and permanent. Ava, overwhelmed with emotion, could barely manage a response beyond a tearful, joyful yes, throwing her arms around him as the afternoon sun continued scattering warm light across the water, exactly as it had on that final summer so many years earlier. They stayed at the lake house until evening, sitting together on the old dock as the sky slowly shifted through brilliant shades of orange and pink, talking quietly about everything that had brought them to this moment. The strange chain of events beginning with a lawyer's cold office and ending here, at the very place where their story had originally begun, decades earlier, before either of them understood what the friendship they shared as children would eventually come to mean. Ava mentioned, as the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, that she had spent years quietly wondering whether she would ever see him again, whether the promise her father had spoken of so briefly before their sudden departure would ever actually come true, or whether it would simply remain another childhood memory slowly fading into irrelevance. She admitted that even after recognizing him in Gerald's office, she had not truly allowed herself to hope for more than a quiet, businesslike arrangement, fearing that hoping for anything deeper would only lead to further heartbreak if he never managed to remember what they had once shared. Ethan, listening to her words, felt a fresh wave of gratitude for everything that had unfolded over the past several months, for the photograph in his father's study, for Charles Whitmore's careless comment at the investor dinner, for the small tarnished lighthouse charm that had unlocked an entire summer of forgotten memories. He told her that he understood now why his father had never fully explained the strange conditions attached to the old business loan, recognizing that the old man had likely hoped, quietly and without pressure, that circumstances alone might eventually guide his son back toward a promise made with genuine love rather than legal obligation. They returned to the city 3 days later, married again in a small, private ceremony attended only by Margaret, Ava's parents, and a handful of close friends, held not in a cold lawyer's office, but in the garden behind their own home, surrounded by flowers Ava had personally chosen and warm laughter that filled every corner of the celebration. Margaret, watching the ceremony with unmistakable pride, admitted afterward to Ethan that she had never seen him look genuinely happy until that very moment, a realization that brought tears to her own eyes despite her usual reserved composure. In the months that followed, Ethan's company continued growing steadily, freed finally from the shadow of debt and manipulation that had once threatened its very existence. Ava, drawing on the sharp business instincts she had demonstrated so clearly during their earlier crisis, began working alongside him more directly, eventually taking on a formal role within the company that allowed her considerable talents to shine in ways neither of them had anticipated when their strange, obligation-bound marriage first began. They returned to the lake house often after that, sometimes alone, sometimes with Margaret or Ava's aging parents, gradually filling the old wooden dock and surrounding shoreline with new memories layered carefully atop the old ones, ensuring that whatever future children they might one day raise would grow up knowing the full, remarkable story of how their parents' lives had once been separated by circumstance, only to be brought back together through a promise neither generation had ever truly abandoned. Looking back years later, Ethan would often reflect on how close he had come to losing everything that mattered most, how easily he might have dissolved the marriage during those early, guarded weeks, mistaking obligation for the entirety of what bound them together, never realizing that beneath the cold legal contract lay something far older, far warmer, and far more enduring than either he or Ava could have possibly imagined walking into that small wedding hall on the day their strange, unlikely story truly began. He had married her out of obligation, forced into an arrangement he had neither chosen nor understood, believing his heart had no place in a transaction built entirely on debt and duty. What he discovered instead, slowly and unexpectedly, was that obligation had merely been the door, and behind it waited a promise he had carried, unknowingly, for over 20 years, a promise finally, fully, and joyfully kept. 2 years after their second wedding, Ethan and Ava stood once again on the same wooden dock, though this time they were not alone. A little girl with dark curls and her father's steady gray eyes toddled unevenly across the sun-warmed planks, giggling as she chased after a dragonfly hovering just out of reach. Ava watched her daughter with a tenderness that still occasionally caught her off guard, amazed at how completely their lives had transformed since the cold afternoon in Gerald Ashworth's office that had once felt like the beginning of an ending, rather than the start of everything good that followed. They had purchased the lake house outright the previous spring, the retired couple who owned it deciding to sell once they learned how much the property meant to the young family, moved by the story Ethan and Ava had shared with them during repeated visits over the years. Restoring the old boathouse had become a weekend project the two of them tackled together, replacing rotted boards and repainting the weathered walls, determined to preserve the character of the place, while ensuring it would remain sturdy enough to welcome future generations exactly as it had welcomed them. Margaret visited often during the summer months, her relationship with Ava having deepened into a genuine closeness neither woman could have predicted during that first tense meeting years earlier. She doted on her granddaughter with an openness she had rarely shown during Ethan's own childhood, admitting once, quietly, that watching Ava build such a warm and secure home had taught her things about love and patience she wished she had understood decades earlier. Ava's own parents, their modest financial worries long since resolved through steady support from Ethan's growing company, spent extended stretches at the lake house as well, delighting in watching their granddaughter grow up surrounded by the same water and pine trees that had shaped their own daughter's happiest childhood memories. The company itself had flourished considerably under their combined leadership, Ava's sharp instincts for identifying inefficiency and opportunity proving invaluable as they expanded into new markets, always careful to protect the 200 employees whose livelihoods had once hung in such precarious balance during those tense early weeks. Gerald Ashworth had faded almost entirely from their lives after the debt was settled, though they occasionally heard news of his business dealings through mutual acquaintances, and Ethan found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he no longer carried any real anger toward the man, recognizing that however manipulative Gerald's methods had been, the strange contract he enforced had ultimately reunited two families and given Ethan back a piece of his own forgotten history he would not trade for anything. One warm evening, as the sun began its slow descent over the water, Ethan found Ava sitting on the dock's edge, their daughter finally asleep in the house behind them, the lighthouse charm resting quietly against her collarbone exactly as it had every single day since they rediscovered the matching pendants years earlier. He sat down beside her, and for a long while neither of them spoke, content simply to watch the light shift and soften across the water, the same view that had once framed a photograph capturing two children whose friendship neither could have imagined would eventually reshape both their lives so completely. Ava finally broke the silence, admitting that she sometimes still found it difficult to believe how everything had unfolded, how a cruel twist of financial obligation had somehow led them back to exactly the place where they belonged all along. Ethan reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and told her that he no longer thought of their beginning as cruel at all, recognizing instead that their fathers had planted something quietly hopeful decades earlier, a seed that had simply needed the right circumstances, however difficult, to finally grow into everything it was always meant to become. He thought often, in quiet moments like this one, about how close he had come to losing it all before he ever truly understood what he had been given, how easily fear and old wounds might have driven him to dissolve the marriage during those uncertain early weeks, convinced that obligation alone could never grow into something real. He was endlessly grateful that fate, and perhaps his father's quiet foresight, had given him just enough time and just enough gentle nudging to remember what truly mattered before it slipped away entirely. As darkness settled gently over the lake and the first stars began appearing above the tree line, Ethan pulled Ava close, resting his chin lightly against the top of her head, and told her, not for the first time but with the same sincerity as always, that he loved her completely, grateful every single day, that a debt meant to bind two strangers together had instead returned to him the one person he had spent over 20 years, without even realizing it, still quietly waiting to find again. Ava smiled against his shoulder, watching the water grow dark and still beneath the emerging stars, and told him softly that she had never once doubted, even through the loneliest years of their separation, that somehow, someday, he would find his way back to her. Their father's promise, born from friendship and hope decades earlier, had finally been kept in full, not through legal obligation or forced circumstance, but through genuine, hard-won love, exactly as both men had quietly dreamed it might be when they first wrote those careful words into an old contract meant to outlast them both. The lake remained peaceful and still long after they had gone inside for the night, its calm surface holding, as it always had, the quiet memory of two children who once raced along its shore without a single worry, unaware that the promise made above their heads that final summer would someday, against every reasonable expectation, come true.